Today I'm going to demonstrate and analyze 4 ways to get from C to A minor. I'll play the etude in full and then I'll break down each progression and analyze it for you. So the first progression is C to F diminished 9 over A flat to A minor. So to understand this progression, first we got to understand the function of the E chord in the key of C. And you might be wondering, why E if there's no E in this chord? But I'll get back to that. So in the key of C, we have all these notes. But with our goal of getting to A minor, the most typical way to do that is to go from its 5 chord. So in the key of A minor, we make a chord off of this E, and then we have our E major chord here, right? Because it has a black key here, it has an outside note that's not typical to the diatonic world of C major. So it's already a fantastic chord because it has this outside color. And so it would sound something like. Absolutely beautiful. But this is a very expected sound. So I wanted to do a play on this, but with more unique colors. So the first thing that I did to obscure the simplicity of C to E to is to put that E chord in first inversion, which is putting the third in the bass. So already it sounds a little bit less stable, and there's the benefit of being able to use a stepwise motion to rise up into A in the bass versus what normally would be. And then the next thing that I did was add some typical jazz tensions. So first we add the flat 9, which is half step above the root. And then we add the sharp 9, which is the flat 3rd. So interestingly enough, we have these 3 tones, flat 9, sharp 9, major 3rd. But dissonance spread over octaves is more palatable. And then the last thing I do is I drop this E down to D, the flat 7 in the key of E. So. And so that's how we have an E chord functionally with no E present. So if I were to label this chord symbol to demonstrate the functionality of the chord most accurately, instead of saying the F diminished 9 over A flat, I would say something like E7, flat 9, sharp 9, no E over G sharp. But it's just the most ridiculous thing to say, like an E chord with no E. That just sounds so dumb. And the chord symbol is getting unreasonably long. So that's why I went with this F diminished 9 over A flat idea. All right, the next progression is C to F sharp minor 7, add 4 to B7 to A minor. So if I wanted to be more accurate with the chord symbol for this first chord here, I guess I should say F sharp minor 7, add 4, no 5, because there's no C sharp in here. But beyond that, this chord progression here is really the simplest one in the whole etude. We've got this F sharp minor sound to B, and that's really just a 2-5 in the key of E. But instead of going to the expected resolution, which is this E chord, I instead take a deceptive turn. We resolve it to that A minor instead. And the way we can trick the listener into accepting this deceptive resolution is because that top melody is so strong. The only thing we gotta do is alter that last note to fit the A minor chord. And then suddenly we have the next progression is C to E flat major 7 sus 2 over B flat to E flat major 7 over B flat to A minor. Sounds like this. So I usually write these chords very intuitively, just playing around with the shapes. And so when I first made the etude, I described this chord as an E flat chord because without that B flat at the bottom, I saw this shape, you move that G down the octave, and suddenly we have an E major 7 add 2 chord. So that's kind of where my head was in describing the symbol. However, upon second look, I really think functionally this chord is a B flat chord instead, because really it's acting as an approach chord from above. So functionally now, I really believe it to be a B flat chord. What obscures the B flat nature of the chord, however, is this E flat in the lower structure of the chord. This note right here. The most sensible double would be a D. But instead of having 2 Ds, we instead go here. The E flat adds an additional color that wouldn't be there otherwise. The second reason why the E flat is there is it has this really, really interesting chord structure now, because this whole chord's motif is the 4th interval. B flat to E flat is a 4th, F to B flat is a 4th, and then D to G is a 4th, all perfect fourths. And then all together has this really beautiful dark sound to it, because 4ths in my opinion sound darker than 5ths, which are more open. And so I really think that that's just such a cool chord structure. So now that we have the idea that really this chord here is a B flat chord, instead of analyzing it as an E flat major 7 add 2 chord over B flat, we could say that it is. The first version without the G would be B flat add 4 chord, and then with the G you could say B flat 6 add 4 chord to A minor. So C, B flat add 4, B flat 6 add 4 to A minor. Our next progression is C to B flat major 13 to B flat major 13 sharp 11 flat 13 to A minor. Sounds like this. So let's talk about this beauty. So there's a couple ways to analyze this chord here. The most immediately logical way would be to assume that the B is the root of the chord and then describe this as a B major 13 chord of some sort. And then all we're doing is we're taking basically an upper approach chord, B down to A minor. However, something I realized, if we get rid of that B, this upper structure really looks like A flat sus4 add 9. And then really, all of these tones here are basically rising into that A minor. So it had me thinking, what if this is just an A flat chord over a B? The next thing going on with this chord progression is we have this beautiful cliche melodic line. And so the chord follows that. But with the pedal held down, then all these chord tones are present. So then if this was a B chord, we would say that this is sharp 11, flat 13. If it was an A flat chord, we would say that it's basically A flat major 13, sus4. Something else that's interesting about the chord structure is that I double this G sharp. Having seen the rest of this video, you'll know that when I can, instead of trying to double notes, I often try to move them so that we can get additional layers of color, more unique tones. So you'd think, why would I not have this G sharp be an F sharp? F sharp is a perfectly normal note to have in a B chord, and it just makes a ton of sense to have it in the lower register. Well, the answer, firstly, is just from an intuitive perspective, I don't like the way that it sounds. I think that this sound is not as good as this one. And I can't tell you why, because all logic would say that the F sharp is better, but something about the A flat speaks to me more. The second thing I think is that if we were to keep this F sharp, when we add the G and the F with that descending melodic line, all these notes start to clash. And we have this crazy cluster here, which sounds pretty ugly. Finally, my thought is, if the G sharp sounds more right in both versions of this chord, maybe this really is an A flat chord rather than a B chord. If we were to analyze this from a B perspective, it would be that B major 13, B major 13, sharp 11, flat 13. If we were to analyze it from the A flat perspective, though, we would be able to say C, A flat sus4 add 9 over B, A flat major 13 sus4 over B to A minor. What type of chord do you think it is? Do you think it's a B chord or an A flat chord? Let me know in the comments. The last thing I do here in this etude is, once we finally resolve down, I add these notes at the end. So where does this come from, really? Well, there's two ways to analyze it. So D and E are two tones a whole step apart. They represent the 9 and the 3 of the key of C. The G and A are the 5th and the 13 in the key of C, or the 5th and the 6th in the key of C. But removing all the numbers and all that nonsense, all you really got to know is it's a C major pentatonic scale, but all played at the same time. Doing to obscure the fact that it's just C major pentatonic scale is I play it like this to emphasize the whole step cluster between the D and the E and the G and the A. But if you think about the vocal tradition, it's pretty common to riff at the end of a song. So, you know, a singer might sing something like, you know, stuff like that. So this is no different than that. And then finally, to bring it back home to the whole point of this, which was to go from C to A, if you just flip the C major pentatonic scale, put that A down in the bass here, it's an A minor pentatonic scale. C major pentatonic scale and A minor pentatonic scale are the same thing, just in a different order. So it sounds very tonal because it is the C major one, but it also represents A minor, bringing us home. The whole point of the progression to go from C to A, and at the end we have some clusters which represent both C and A. And I think that's a nice way to tie it up. So if you learned something, please hit that subscribe button or give me a thumbs up. You could also let me know in the comments which of the 4 progressions was your favorite. I really enjoyed making this video. You could find the Chord A2 on my Instagram or Shorts. And you can also check out my channel for other methods of getting from one chord to another in the key of C. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.